It begins in the quiet hours of early morning in Karagwe, a small highland town where people are used to waking up to the soft echo of church bells and the slow rhythm of rural life. But lately, that familiar peace has been replaced by something else, an uneasy silence the kind people feel when neighbors whisper, when doors lock earlier than usual, and when mothers hold their children a little closer because no one knows who might disappear next. For weeks, Tanzanians have lived under the shadow of fear. Reports of abductions, ordinary citizens, young activists, even small local leaders have spread from village to village, each story sounding more painful than the last. And then something no one expected happened. A respected church leader, Bishop Benson Bagoza of the Lutheran Diocese of Karagwe, stepped forward and broke the silence with a message that stunned the entire nation. He wrote publicly with a calm and steady voice that if the government believes abducting its critics is the path to restoring trust, then they should come for him. "I am ready to be taken," he said. It was not a cry for attention. It was an act of courage in a moment when courage had nearly vanished. This is where our story begins, not with politicians or soldiers, but with an ordinary morning and an extraordinary act of moral defiance. A nation shaken, a community afraid, and a bishop who decided that fear should not speak louder than truth. But what pushes a religious leader to put his own life on the line? What has happened inside Tanzania that a man of faith must volunteer himself to protect his people? And more importantly, what does this moment reveal about leadership, justice, and the future of a country struggling to find its moral compass? If you believe that truth should never be silenced and that courage, no matter where it comes from, deserves to be heard, stay with us. And please consider subscribing, especially if you want stories the headlines are not telling. The story of what happened in Tanzania does not begin in a courtroom or a government office. It begins on dusty village roads, in crowded markets, and in the quiet corners of homes where families whisper about loved ones who left one morning and never returned. For many Tanzanians, life has always been shaped by hardship, but never before by the fear that speaking honestly could get someone taken in the middle of the night. This slow, spreading fear became the backdrop against which Bishop Benson Bagoza decided to raise his voice. Bagoza is not a politician, nor is he the kind of man who seeks the spotlight. He leads a Lutheran diocese in Karagwe, where he spends most days counseling families, visiting villages, and guiding young people through the challenges of faith and daily survival. His role has always been to comfort, not confront. But when reports of abductions increased, when churches began receiving requests for prayers from families searching for missing sons and daughters, he realized silence was no longer an option. The tension reached a breaking point when citizens began accusing the government of using abductions as a tool to silence criticism. Local leaders, activists, and ordinary men and women who questioned government decisions were vanishing without explanation. Rumors grew louder each day. People whispered that certain police officers were acting without transparency, that unknown vehicles were seen near homes shortly before a disappearance, and that families received no answers when they begged authorities for help. In this climate of fear, Bishop Bagoza wrote a long, carefully worded message on his social media page. It was not emotional, not reckless, but profoundly bold. He described the political climate as fragile, the public trust as broken, and the future of the nation as uncertain. His words were not aimed at inciting chaos. They were aimed at forcing a long overdue conversation about justice, truth, and the responsibilities of leadership. Then came the sentence that shook the country. "If abducting citizens restores your credibility, then come and take me." It was a statement no one expected from a church leader in a nation where religious voices are usually cautious. Yet, Bagoza made it clear he was ready to risk his safety if that sacrifice would help Tanzania confront its truth. He framed his message not as rebellion, but as a call to conscience, a plea for the government to recognize its own humanity. Immediately after, he expanded his message with a reflection on Tanzania's national journey. He used a powerful metaphor, tutoke chumbani tulale sebuleni, let us leave the bedroom and sleep in the living room. It was an invitation for leaders to step out of comfort and face the reality of the country's wounds. He spoke about acknowledging mistakes, recognizing the suffering of families, and the urgent need for national healing. From there, he transitioned into sharing what would later be known as the 10 Points of Renewal, a list of actions he believed were necessary to restore trust in government and protect the lives of Tanzanians. But before he listed those 10 points, he emphasized one simple truth: a nation cannot move forward if its leaders refuse to listen to the pain of its people. Across Tanzania, his words quickly spread. Some shared them quietly, afraid to comment, but desperate for hope. Others circulated them boldly, seeing in Bagoza's courage a reflection of their own frustrations. For the first time in months, people felt someone was speaking on behalf of the voiceless. And it wasn't an opposition politician or a foreign activist, it was a bishop from Karagwe, a man whose authority came not from power, but from moral responsibility. At this moment, the story reached its turning point. Tanzania was no longer just dealing with rumors or social media complaints. It was dealing with a respected spiritual leader openly challenging the state's way of handling dissent. And his declaration, gentle but firm, became the foundation for a national reckoning that could no longer be ignored. In the days that followed Bishop Bagoza's message, ordinary Tanzanians felt the tension spreading through their communities like a rising storm. Mothers stood at doorways longer than usual, watching the roads with anxious eyes. In small cafes across Dar es Salaam and in remote villages near the Rwandan border, people leaned closer during conversations, lowering their voices when the topic turned to utekaji nyara abductions. Life continued on the surface, but underneath the nation was trembling. And then came the moment the entire country felt Bishop Bagoza released his 10 Points of Renewal, a list so direct, so uncompromising, that it became the emotional peak of the unfolding crisis. Each point struck at a painful truth, peeling back layers of fear, frustration, and long-suppressed anger. His first point cut through the silence like a blade. Stop the abductions immediately. Arrest suspects legally, publicly identify those responsible. He stated clearly that kidnapping is the behavior of mafia-style governments, not constitutional ones. Families deserve to know where their loved ones are. The nation deserves transparency. It was the boldest accusation yet, and the one everyone had been too afraid to voice. His second point warned that ignoring this would not only endanger citizens, but also the police officers and government officials themselves. When leaders break the law, he wrote, they teach the nation to break it too. For many Tanzanians, it was the first time someone had named the unspoken truth: the cycle of violence would not spare anyone. The third point shook the political class. Bagoza called for the release of all political prisoners, including the well-known opposition figure Tundu Lissu. He insisted that national healing cannot happen while dissenters remain behind bars or hidden away after forced disappearances. Some cheered his bravery. Others feared he had crossed a line that would make him an even greater target. His fourth point confronted the growing surveillance state. He criticized the government for hunting citizens online, even arresting people for using VPNs or making critical posts. Freedom of expression, he wrote, is not a privilege. It is a right. Those words resonated deeply in a society where phones had become instruments of fear rather than communication. The fifth point touched the nation's deepest wound, the government's refusal to acknowledge that people had died in political unrest. Without truth, Bagoza said, people remain with bitterness. It was a call for moral responsibility, one many Tanzanians had been waiting to hear from someone with authority. Points 6 and 7 were delivered as metaphors, sharp, memorable, unsettling. He spoke of the dog and the dog's owner. In his analogy, the owner who fears his own dog has already lost control. The dog who learns the owner fears him becomes dangerous. It was a poetic yet unmistakable warning to President Samia Suluhu: a government cannot rule through fear of its own people. These two metaphors spread across the country in less than a day, repeated in homes, markets, and churches. His eighth point criticized the government's investigative commissions, saying they seemed designed not to seek truth, but to blame protesters instead of those who harmed them. His ninth point condemned the use of religious figures and symbols as political tools. There will come a day, he warned, when a sheikh may draw a cross in a mosque. It was a stark reminder of how manipulation can corrupt even sacred spaces. And then came the 10th point, the one that ignited the strongest reaction: stop blaming outsiders. If you believe citizens can be influenced so easily, try influencing them with truth and humility. In other words, lead by example, not by fear. The nation reacted instantly. Some praised Bagoza as a hero, others feared for his life. Religious leaders began to whisper that the church could no longer stay silent. Opposition groups celebrated his courage, and government supporters accused him of destabilizing the nation. But one thing was undeniable: the bishop had spoken words that could no longer be buried. His 10 points had become a mirror, reflecting the nation's pain, and Tanzania was now staring at its own reflection, unable to look away. On the streets of Tanzania, the consequences of Bishop Bagoza's message began to show in the smallest, most human ways. In markets where women usually laugh loudly while selling vegetables, the laughter became softer. Men who once freely debated politics over cups of chai now paused before speaking, scanning the surroundings as if danger might be sitting at the next table. The country's emotional climate had shifted. A nation already bruised by months of fear was now confronted with a difficult truth. Someone had finally said openly what many had whispered in private, and the government had no immediate answer. The first and most visible consequence was a deepening crisis of trust. People no longer believed that the government could or would protect them. Parents warned their children to avoid political conversations. University students once active online deleted posts and closed accounts. Even civil servants who typically keep quiet to protect their jobs whispered about what might happen next. This was not the usual tension of politics. It was the quiet unraveling of confidence in the system itself. Politically, the situation became even more fragile. Opposition members, especially those previously targeted, felt more exposed than ever. Some fled to neighboring countries like Kenya, fearing that staying in Tanzania could cost them their freedom or their lives. These departures were not just political gestures, they were acts of survival. Each person who crossed the border became a symbol of the growing divide between the citizens and the state. Within government circles, a different kind of tension grew. Ministers and senior officials knew that Bishop Bagoza's 10 points had struck a nerve with the public. They could feel the shift in the air. Conversations in hallways became shorter meetings, more controlled, and public statements more carefully crafted. Some officials worried that the bishop's words had awakened frustrations that had been simmering for too long. Others feared the opposite, that the government's silence would be seen as confirmation of the accusations. Meanwhile, in churches across the country, worship services took on a new tone. Pastors and priests prayed more openly for justice, safety, and truth. Congregations, often quiet and respectful, murmured in agreement when spiritual leaders mentioned the need for national healing. Religious communities, usually the backbone of Tanzania's social stability, were beginning to subtly distance themselves from the state. This shift did not happen loudly or dramatically. It happened through sermons, prayers, and quiet affirmations that echoed the bishop's call for accountability. Among ordinary citizens, the emotional toll was unmistakable. Families who had lost relatives to disappearances felt a renewed sense of grief, as if someone had reopened a wound that had never properly healed. Some felt empowered by the bishop's courage, while others feared that his boldness would provoke retaliation. But all of them shared one sentiment: the country was standing at a dangerous crossroads. Economically and socially, uncertainty began to creep into daily life. Businesses hesitated to invest. Young people felt less hopeful about the future. Community leaders reported rising anxiety, especially among those living near areas known for previous political unrest. It became clear that without transparency and accountability, Tanzania risked sliding deeper into instability. Through all this, the government's silence only made the consequences heavier. By not responding quickly or clearly, it allowed fear and suspicion to grow unchecked. And in a nation already struggling with political wounds, silence can be louder than any spoken threat. Bishop Bagoza's message did more than criticize the government. It exposed the fragile foundation on which Tanzania's sense of security was built. And as the emotional dust settled, one truth became painfully clear: a country cannot find peace when its people feel unheard, unsafe, and unseen. From an American perspective, especially for those who lived through the civil rights era, the Cold War, and the long debates about democracy, the situation in Tanzania feels painfully familiar. When a government begins to silence critics, monitor citizens, and deny the truth about its own actions, older Americans recognize the warning signs immediately. They have seen them in history books, documentaries, and sometimes in their own lifetimes. And for many watching from across the Atlantic, Bishop Bagoza's stand evokes memories of figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Archbishop Oscar Romero, and Desmond Tutu, leaders who understood that moral courage is often the last line of defense when institutions begin to crumble. In the United States, conversations around Tanzania have remained mostly quiet, overshadowed by global conflicts, elections, and economic concerns. But within human rights circles, church networks, and African diaspora communities, the alarm bells have grown louder. Advocacy groups tracking religious freedom and democratic integrity have warned that Tanzania is moving in a direction that undermines its previous reputation as one of East Africa's most stable nations. For Americans who value freedom of speech as a constitutional right, the idea of people being abducted for using VPNs or criticizing their government is deeply unsettling. Some analysts in Washington also see Tanzania's internal unrest as part of a larger African shift. Across the continent, citizens have begun demanding stronger leadership, clearer accountability, and greater independence from old political structures. Countries like Burkina Faso, under leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré, have captured international attention by rejecting foreign interference and pursuing models centered on sovereignty and public trust. Whether one agrees with Traoré's approach or not, his rise has encouraged global discussions about what African leadership should look like in the 21st century: transparent, courageous, and rooted in the will of the people. For American observers, this contrast is striking. On one side, Tanzania struggles with secrecy fear and shrinking civic space. On the other, nations like Burkina Faso are gaining respect for confronting internal challenges openly and engaging citizens directly. This comparison has prompted many U.S. scholars to ask a difficult question: why are some African governments moving toward transparency, while others tighten control? World governments have taken cautious positions. Western nations often avoid strong statements out of diplomatic sensitivity. Neighboring African countries facing their own political pressures respond carefully, hoping not to spark unrest within their borders. Yet silence from the international community does not mean indifference. Behind closed doors, diplomats worry that Tanzania's pattern, if ignored, could set a precedent that encourages similar tactics in other nations. For older Americans watching this unfold, there is a deeper emotional connection. They lived through times when ordinary people had to stand up against powerful institutions. They remember how long it took for justice to prevail, how many were silenced before their voices were finally heard. When they see Bishop Bagoza stand before his nation and declare his willingness to be taken for the sake of truth, they see not just a religious man, they see a reminder of humanity's long struggle against fear and oppression. From the outside, the world views Tanzania at a crossroads. Its choices in the coming months will determine whether the nation follows a path of transparency and reform, or whether it continues down a road where fear becomes a tool of governance. And for many in America, especially those who value moral leadership, the question becomes clear: will Tanzania choose truth, or will it silence the people who speak it? As the dust settles over Tanzania, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. A nation is never truly tested during times of comfort. It is tested when the voices of its own people begin to tremble. And in this story, that trembling voice did not come from a politician or a foreign diplomat or a wealthy power broker. It came from a bishop, from a man who wakes up to the same morning light as every other citizen, who walks the same streets, who hears the same fears whispered in church pews and market stalls. A man who finally said aloud what millions felt in silence. Bishop Bagoza reminded Tanzania and the world that moral courage is often the final shield against the decay of justice. His 10 points were not weapons, they were mirrors. Mirrors held up to a government, to a society, and to a moment in history when truth is too easily buried beneath fear. And now the question that hangs over Tanzania is simple yet heavy. Will the nation look into that mirror, or will it shatter it? For older Americans watching from afar, this moment carries an unsettling familiarity. They remember the marches, the sermons, the sacrifices made when freedom had to be defended not by swords or armies, but by people willing to stand in the line of fire with only their conviction to protect them. They know that when a country begins losing the courage to listen to its own citizens, it starts losing the foundation that holds it together. The warning is clear. A government that silences criticism today may face unrest tomorrow. A society that fears speaking the truth will one day struggle to recognize it. And a people who learn to whisper may forget the sound of their own voice. Tanzania stands at this edge, and what happens next, whether reform or repression, will define not just its politics, but its soul. But this story is also part of a larger shift across Africa. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso have shown that integrity, transparency, and national dignity can still inspire hope in places long overshadowed by corruption and foreign pressure. This contrast forces a deeper question. Do you believe Tanzania needs leaders who stand with the people, the way many Africans believe President Ibrahim Traoré stands with his, or will fear continue to guide decisions that should be shaped by justice and compassion? Before we end, let me ask you directly. If you were in Bishop Bagoza's place, if speaking up could cost you everything, would you still choose the truth? If this story moved you? If you believe that no nation should silence its own children? If you want to be among the first to know and support leaders in Africa who choose truth over comfort, please share this video. And subscribe if you believe that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most powerful truth.